FDF Resolute, Sanctum-class battlecruiser, en route to NT 2125 Deep Fringe. Mary had been rather intrigued by the concept of an observation deck on a ship. Curator ship designs didn't even have windows, let alone a whole deck. Yet, deck seemed a bit of a grand exaggeration now that she was standing in the room with the large window dominating one wall. The room was empty aside from herself, though there were tables and chairs enough to fit a few dozen people easily. No doubt it was more in use if the ship should be hosting dignitaries over some important planet or picturesque astronomical feature. En route to NT 2125, however, they were instead enveloped in the ink, a sight no one seemed keen on viewing. Her education had of course touched on the existence of the ink, but that was about it. She had no idea how it really was used to facilitate FTL travel. What she did know, now that she was looking at it, was that it was rather unpleasant to look at. She had seen purest black. The concept of looking at entirely nothing but a void was fine with her. The ink, however, while she watched it slowly move around before her eyes, it was like a vast ocean of some kind, an ocean of incredible depth. When she had first stepped into the room and seen it dominating the large window, she had thought it to be a mixture of blues, purples, and blacks. But the longer she watched the bubbles and lines slowly moving around, she wasn't sure if she were seeing color at all. Maybe she was seeing not the absence of light, but something opposite to it. As if the ink gave off anti-light. She had no basis for this thought, of course. No training, education, or experience to make her believe it was a real thing. Yet if matter had antimatter, why couldn't light have anti-light? After all, the longer she looked, the more it felt like she wasn't really seeing anything. Nothing real anyway. More like if she closed her eyes and rubbed against the eyelids and saw the attempts of her brain understand the shadows. Then there was the thought maybe she really was seeing something. Something just under the waves of its vast, deep ocean of anti-light. After all, what was causing it to move? Were the waves, ripples, and bubbles purely random? Or was there something making it move? As unpleasant as her line of thinking was, at least watching it gave her some small, alone time on the otherwise crowded vessel. It also gave her an excuse to keep her headset muted. She would much rather deal with staring out at a vast ocean of anti-light than listen to the ship around her at this point. Yet the moment she began to consider that, she saw a flash in the bottom of her vision. Door opening. With a flick, she started the program to let her headset gradually increase volume as her ears began to work again. First sound, click of hard heel on metallic decking. Second sound, sharp intake of breath, likely indicating surprise, anxiety, unease, or combination. Third sound, a tongue flicking against teeth before making a disapproving sucking sound. Fourth sound, fabric on fabric rubbing, was very low and soft, indicating luxury stitching and material. "Hello, Director Obley." "Translator," came the curt reply, though said at a perfectly reasonable volume for normal speaking. Mary winced a bit. Going from total silence to even the muted sounds she was getting now was rough at times, especially as more just kept building. Even at this low level, the sound of the ships began to return to her, the groan of metal, the hum of electricity, the distant murmur of people going about their tasks. She had no idea what she'd do without the headset to at least partially mute the world around her. "Your bodyguards aren't joining us?" Mary glanced over at the Hool Rav in his custom suit. She couldn't see his guards, but she could hear them just outside. She recognized Hru from his breathing pattern, as smoking had done a number on his lungs. Based on the jingle of grenade tabs, the other was Jewel. "If the curators wanted me dead, I highly doubt they'd create you just for the task. They're more than powerful enough to have no need for subtlety or subterfuge." Even though the director was talking to her, he was looking out the window at the ink. She could see the disdain on his face rather obviously, a hand moving up to nervously brush his furry chin, even as he tilted his horns side to side. While he seemed focused on the ink, her mind returned to his curious comment. Did the curators need to employ subterfuge? Of course they were powerful, but surely there was also use in subterfuge. Regardless, she had not been sent to kill the director. Or anyone, for that matter. She had no training in combat or related topics. He seemed to also be thinking about this, though, as he looked at her. "You aren't here to kill me, right?" "No, I'm not here to kill you or anyone else," she assured him. "I'm just here to facilitate communications during the negotiations. It is curious, though, why the custodians sent anyone at all." He trailed off, and while she was about to answer, he turned and spoke first. "Actually, do you mind if we talk somewhere else?" At the end, his eyes darted to the window and the swirl of the ink beyond. "Certainly," she nodded and gestured to the door, letting him go first. "I appreciate it," he commented, and even as he stepped through the door, Hru stepped in front of him to lead, while Jewel stepped up behind Mary to follow. "I will admit it spoils my plans a bit. I wanted to talk with you in private a little, but, I do not particularly enjoy looking at the ink." She could hear his breathing pattern change just being in the hallway, out of sight of the swirling anti-light. "I'm sure we can find privacy elsewhere, though I am unsure what kind of private chat you would like. I'm here strictly as a neutral party to facilitate negotiations," she reminded him. "As you've said many times." Obley waved off her remark. "Anyway, since you're new to this sort of thing, I just want to introduce you to my underling since you'll be working for him during the start of the talks." Mary frowned at this sudden revelation. "First, I don't work for you or your subordinate. I are a neutral translator provided by the curators." He waved her off again as they walked. All around her she could hear the ship and its crew going about keeping the ship alive, as it were. It was an older vessel, and every creak and groan of stressed metal or electrical spark continued to heighten her anxiety. She could not wait to get off this vessel and onto a planet. "I meant work for him in a more metaphorical sense. I know you likely expected to work with me throughout these talks, but it's just not how labor talks to management. They don't get to start by talking to a director. They'll start with someone just important enough to garner attention but with no real power. If he fails, I swoop in and save things. If he succeeds, I get to take credit in the end and talk about how I knew he was the man for the job." The further they walked from the observation deck and the ink, the more confident and in fact arrogant Obley got. She wasn't particularly keen on his behavior, but she had at least grown accustomed to it on the trip so far. "Why then did you spend most of this trip testing my abilities as a translator?" "Because I was trying to figure out your angle," he replied with a glance back over his shoulder as they reached a lift. The four of them filtered into it before Jewel hit the button for the hangar deck. "I don't have an angle. I was instructed to come here and facilitate," she began, but he yet again waved her off. "Neutral, yes, but why? We've never needed nor requested curator assistance for anything like this. We have a proven history of successfully ending labor disputes and organization efforts. So why have the curators bothered to send you? Shouldn't you be trying to help keep the FDF from falling apart? Or spreading the word of the curators to the masses or something? That is something they do, right? Proselytize?" Mary was fairly confident Obley tried to be dismissive about the curators just to make himself more comfortable. It was a minor enough annoyance to overlook, though she wondered if it actually helped ease his fragile ego. "The curators do not proselytize, no. They have no need. They exist. They act. They do not need the approval of others, nor belief in their correctness. I am here because I have been ordered to be here. I was told I must assist in negotiating between the belligerent parties on NT 2125 and observe the outcome. That is all. If the curators have a deeper reason for sending me here, I do not know it." While she spoke, she could already hear Obley clicking his tongue in disapproval. Hru was trying and failing to breathe quietly. Jewel was running her hand over a smooth, metallic object in her right pocket, slowly turning it over. "I know you are flesh and blood, but you're more like your creators than I find comforting," Obley very bluntly commented. "I do not exist for your comfort," Mary pointedly replied, which made Obley click his tongue in disapproval once more. By that point, the lift stopped and the doors opened. The rush of sound from the hangar deck made her wince a moment as she had to deal with the sudden volume as she lowered her headset sensitivity. "I don't think you exist for your own comfort either," Obley remarked, now smirking a little at her obvious discomfort. There was little she could do but cast a glare in his direction as the pain subsided and the sounds took on a more muted level. Looking out across the hangar, she could see dozens of people moving around and working on the ship's complement of shuttles and fighters. No one was expecting combat, but that didn't stop the captain from preparing anyway. While she was told most of the machinery operated at frequencies most species couldn't hear, it always gave her a headache to be around so many buzzing, grinding, churning machines. Regardless, Obley continued, I want to make it clear I have been authorized to extend to the curators our most sincere intent to be friends. If there is anything we can do to make your job more comfortable, let me know. And if you see fit to pass on anything you hear from the labor organizers, direct compensation is on offer. I am here as a neutral party, she reminded him yet again, but he just spread his hands and smiled. We're willing to pay for even what you would consider banter and gossip. Anything you hear. My subordinate is also authorized to compensate you, but I'd prefer a direct copy. He held out an encryption cylinder. While she had no intention of passing along anything, she did take it. It might be useful for other reasons. I don't have a bank account, you know, or any credits. When she told him this, he looked entirely confused. I'm not paid for my efforts. Curators do not use currency of any kind. Resources are simply provided as needed. Director Obley's look of pure disgust was even more obvious than when he'd been in the observation deck. And here I thought they were civilized. But it's then all the more important for you to start building up your own nest egg. He began to pull a credit chip from his pocket, but she waved him off. I'm not chipped, nor do I have a slate. This time he scoffed and looked confused, even as he held it out. You can take the whole thing. How do you expect to pay for anything on the planet without credits? He seemed genuinely baffled. I don't expect to pay for anything on the planet. Your company has extended their most sincere intent to be friends after all. As she tilted her head a little while looking at him, Obley just snorted. Ah, this is why my assistant was babbling about an expense waiver. Yes, there are limits to it, you know. Food, drink, necessities only. Mary just stared at him until he finally sighed and tucked the credit chip back into his pocket. Fine. It's best for you to go change now then. The shuttle will be leaving as soon as we hit real space. She was wondering why he'd brought her here directly. And why am I changing? Well, you can go as you are if you like. But this isn't a curator ship. The Resolute has to drop further away from the planet so the shuttle will be in space to close the gap to the planet. And I mean, clearly curator tech never breaks or has any accidents, but our poor mortal hands make poor mortal vessels. Obley spread his hands as if to highlight his own soft, well-manicured hands. Fine. While her suit wasn't as comfortable as her normal clothes, she didn't intend on being the only one killed by some sort of accident on the way to the planet. It would set a terrible precedent. So she walked away from Obley and his guards, then towards the hangar's locker room. As she strode across the deck, stepping over fuel and coolant lines, she tried to make some sense of the mass of sound around her. Obley no doubt thought she was beyond earshot when he spoke to his guards. Strange bird. Easy on the eyes, though. Rue cleared his throat a moment to reply in a gravely raspy voice. Think the curators made her to be attractive to most species somehow? Robot magic or something? I don't know. Maybe. I still don't know why they sent anyone at all. I don't trust those damned machines, Obley replied. She had expected this sort of reaction. It was in line with their comments during the trip. Other than that, most of the technicians, mechanics, and pilots moving around the hangar seemed much more focused on their work than anything else. Grumblings about the captain's standards and an apparent lack of spare parts. Based on the overall comments, it seemed to be more about not wanting to do so much work, rather than serious concerns over abilities to keep ships functional. Or so she hoped. Once in the locker room, she made her way to the back where a special case had been installed for her suit. While she would have preferred to travel on a curator vessel, she was glad to at least get a curator suit. They didn't have many organics, but the suits they made for her and the other lifted were absolutely the best in terms of survivability, durability, and protection, just not comfort. Since the locker room seemed to be empty, she quickly stripped down, setting aside the encryption cylinder Obley had given her. For a moment, she examined herself, along the deep red feathers of her head and neck, gradually turning to a sunburst yellow down her torso, and finally a rich, deep blue along her legs and tail. Did species find her attractive? If the curators had intended for this, they likely would have included it in her training, surely. Must just be Obli and his guards. Stepping up to the curator case, she hit the activation button, and then held perfectly still as the case opened, arms moving out to begin affixing the suit to her body. First, she felt the snap of metal rings around her ankles, wrists, neck, hips, and ribs before the rest of the exoskeleton was built up around it. Then came the cool mesh of the inner suit pulled up underneath it and against her feathers. Next was the composite slotted into the outside, layered and overlapped for maximum coverage. Finally, she prepared herself for the final step as two hoses connected to the metal collar around her neck. She hated this part. When the liquid began to pump into the lining between the mesh and the composite layer, it was ice cold and caused her to gasp and shudder as it filled in. It took a few minutes while she tried to carefully control her breathing and push past the cold. Once it was finally full, the suit activated and the liquid turned solid, controlled by the sophisticated curator chip in her skull. Her temperature quickly began to return to normal now, and she took a slow, deep breath in relief before taking the helmet the case offered last. She refrained from putting the helmet on yet, though. It wasn't quite big enough for her taste, and always rubbed her ear tips. Walking back out into the hangar, she could feel the suit somewhat flowing around her movements. It would turn liquid to move, then solid when it didn't need to. She was also told it would go selectively rigid to deflect projectiles, a feature she hoped to never test. Looking around a moment, she saw Obli near the closest shuttle, speaking to someone wearing an executive pattern suit. Luxurious and comfortable, but she'd prefer the curator suit in an emergency. Next to him was a human in a deep blue armored suit with steel accents. As she watched, he draped a travel cloak over the shoulders of the suit. An interesting touch. Walking towards them, she had to stop a moment to let a rumbling hangar tug past. Several technicians rode in the back, carried to their next task. Judging on the whine of the back left wheel, she figured their next task might be to fix the tug itself. Either way, she continued on up to Director Obli. "Translator, I'd like you to meet Kingus." Obli gestured to the figure in the executive suit. Up close, she could see through his helmet's faceplate and examine the Nikvich inside. Rather stubby bone ridges, rather young then for an executive. "Translator." He nodded to her. "Kingus, it's nice to meet you. My name is Mary, though translator is just fine as well." She took an amicable approach for now. "Yes, this is my bodyguard Eli." He gestured to the human next to him, who made for an imposing figure in his armor. With his helmet in place, the steel visor reflected a distorted reflection of herself back at her. "Ma'am." He nodded and extended a hand out from under his cloak. Shifting her helmet to her left hand, she carefully reached out to shake his hand in return. "Eli, it's nice to meet you." The first human she'd found in the employ of the company, though she knew most of the problems on the planet were related to their human miners. Allegedly, at least. "Nice to meet you as well, ma'am." His shake was firm but not aggressive. "We should be ready shortly. They're loading the last of some food supplies, and then we're waiting on the Marines." "Food supplies? I don't even know what we're taking down there. Argyle is a full-fledged city. The problems it's facing are related to labor terrorists, not famine," Kingus mentioned with a huff. "It's likely my food," Mary answered. "The curators were unsure how long I would be here and sent me with a full complement of prepared meals." "Oh," Kingus coughed lightly. "Well, that's fine then. I wasn't aware you had special dietary needs, but the Marines at least should be here. What's taking them so long?" He tried to deflect a little and looked around. As if summoned by his complaint, she saw a group of human soldiers approaching the shuttle. The few times she had seen soldiers so far, they'd been in smart uniforms and moving with purpose and sharp, specific gestures. These did not look nearly so impressive, or poised. Instead, the group just walked casually towards them, in a mixture of armor sets. Most had a haphazard, drab, olive-green coat of paint, but much of it was chipped and worn. Not to mention, much of it was also covered in writing, drawings and decals that she doubted were officially sanctioned. Only the man in the lead looked to be in a truly official uniform set of armor. "I'm Lieutenant Barrow. I assume this is the shuttle we want." "Barrow, this is Kingus, our executive labor liaison." Director Obley introduced them. "This is our translator, Mary." "Never seen one of you before. What species are you?" Mary turned to look at the soldier who'd spoken to her. He was just next to the officer, and his armor looked particularly beat up. She also noticed signs of scorch marks in several places. Unlike the single smooth faceplate of Eli's armor, his helmet looked more like a scowling face with golden lenses in the eyes. "I am not an official species. I was lifted by the curators to act as a translator," she informed him directly. "Interesting. So you're a bird, but you've got ears. What's with the headset?" He gestured up at it as she reflexively reached up with her free hand to touch the side. "There was a slight miscalculation in my creation, and I find most settings to be uncomfortably loud. The headset is to regulate the volume of my surroundings to prevent damage and discomfort," she explained. "What? Wait. The curators made a translator who gets hurt by sound? Am I understanding that right?" Mary frowned at his comment. "That's somewhat reductive." She tried to deflect. "Is it wrong?" he pressed. "It's not entirely inaccurate." Disparaging on the work of the curators wasn't something she was comfortable with. "That's a fancy way of saying I'm right. So your job, which is listening to things, actively hurts you. Man, sucks to be you." A few of the other Marines snickered and giggled behind him as Mary frowned. "Gunny, that's enough." Barrow finally waved off the other Marine. "Where's the rest of your company? And the Major?" Obley asked now, thankfully moving things along. "Elsewhere. He said if you're not going to the planet yet, he doesn't see a reason to go either. My platoon and I are sufficient at this time. Once you're ready to head down, then the rest of the company will deploy." Barrow shrugged. "You send your flunky first, he sends his flunky too." "We have concerns about possible terrorist strikes on civilians during the labor talks. Are you sure a platoon is really sufficient?" Kingus asked. The officer sucked in a breath, likely about to answer, but Gunny cut him off. "Isn't it interesting? All across the fringe, you corporate types like to talk about how safe and secure your mining colonies are, biding everyone to bring their families and get to work. Yet the moment a union starts to form, you start screaming about terrorists and how you need the military to keep order." "Gunny," the officer hissed at him. Gunny waved it off a moment as the officer cleared his throat. "Your own reports suggest corporate security is robust enough to secure the city. We have no intel to suggest any threats of terrorist strikes by the miners are really valid. A platoon will suffice for now. If the situation changes, the rest of the company can deploy very quickly, I assure you." "Fine. But remember, just because the miners in question are human doesn't mean you can give them free rein. The FDF, and by extension the Marines, rely on our funding to keep functioning," Kingus replied. "You never let us fucking forget." Gunny muttered that barely under his breath. Neither Kingus or Obley seemed to pick up on this, but Mary did. "Many species across the fringe have been generous enough to accept many human refugees. We obviously seek a future of cooperation and mutual success. This is not about humans being singled out. They have been given the same rights and contracts as all other species who join our corporate family." Director Obley smiled and spread his hands in a friendly gesture. "We ask only that you protect the talks because they're so important to our continued well-being as united front here on the fringe. The tide comes for us all and we must be ready. Together." "Well said, Director." Kingus nodded in support. "Fucking please," Gunny muttered, and made some sort of gesture with his fist, making a pumping motion in front of his hips. From the reports the curators had given her, really what it seemed like was the humans massively increased their productivity, but in exchange wanted better treatment from the various industrial consortiums. The executives like Obley enjoyed the productivity but felt treating them better would set a bad precedent. Across the fringe, however, humans had been getting their way more often than not. NT 2125 was by far the biggest, most high-profile case, but she didn't imagine it would be anything special. "Yes, well, we are here to keep you safe and make sure no one kills anyone, on either side," The officer assured them and then gestured at the shuttle. Shall we? Have a nice flight, translator. Remember to call me. Obley smiled and nodded at her. I'm sure we'll be in touch, Director. She finally pulled her helmet up and on, feeling it settle into place with a click and a soft hiss at it pressurized. The very tips of her ears were lightly pressed in by the sides, which was why she'd waited this long to put it on. The Marines began to board the shuttle first, shuffling along rows in the center to get into seats with metal shoulder restraints that would help hold them in place. Hey, so you're a lifted? What do the curators want you here for? What's the deal? Gunny asked as he waited near the back for the others to shuffle in. I am not at liberty at this time to discuss the curators or their work. Mary's forehead felt slightly warm as she answered him. Oh, come on. There's got to be something special the curators want you here for, Gunny insisted. I am not at liberty at this time to discuss the curators or their work. Mary's forehead felt a bit warmer still. Gunny, leave her alone, Barrow instructed. Come on, why a translator at all? We've got earpieces. I've never seen a translator before, let alone a curator one. By now, the other Marines were seated, and Mary began to shuffle up the row looking for a free seat. Ma'am, you'll need to take one of the jump seats up front. These harnesses aren't made for your curator suit. Barrow tapped one of the set of shoulder restraints, so she kept shuffling past the row of Marines towards the front. I don't rely on machine translation. I am fluent in over 600 languages and forms of communication. I listen to all parties and ensure nothing is lost in translation, she assured them. Only 600? I knew of a guy who was fluent in over 6 million forms of communication. Gunny's voice had a slightly different tone to it. Was he joking? 6 million seems excessive. I assure you I am well trained for my job. Now at the front of the shuttle, she found the jump seat in question. Yet when she went to pull the seat down, the dangerous whine and groan of the metal hinged did not inspire her with confidence. Still, it was her mission, so she settled into the seat and went about trying to figure out the harness. Barrow approached her and pointed to the straps in order to help her out. You'll be fine. This is really just a precaution. The lieutenant nodded and gave her shoulder a pat. She smiled up at him then, her faceplate clear unlike their armor. It was thought to be better for non-verbal communication cues if people she spoke to could see her face. Kingus and Eli were the last to settle in seats nearby. Hey, corpse! Gunny called out as Eli settled into his seat and set the shoulder restraints with practiced ease. Excuse me? Eli looked across the aisle at Gunny. You're corporate security, right? Corpsec. Gunny more carefully pronounced, but Mary was positive he hadn't made a mistake earlier. I'm a private bodyguard. I work on contract. Eli corrected him. Oh, well, anyway, the fuck is with the cloak? Gunny gestured at the deep blue cloak draped over Eli's shoulders and body. You're in a suit, right? Kind of the point of a spacesuit to be waterproof and somewhat heat-proof and shit, yeah? Kind of defeats the point of a cloak, right? So what gives? It's about looking stylish. Something you clearly have no concept of, gunnery sergeant. Eli's response seemed to take Gunny by surprise. The Gunny? Was Gunny a nickname or a title? Either way, the Marines around snickered and chuckled a bit, though she could hear Gunny snort. Barrow took the jump seat next to her instead of one of the more secure seats, possibly to help set her at ease, which she appreciated. So, Lieutenant, do you expect this mission to be dangerous? What? Protecting the talks? No, we've done this a few times so far. It's pretty boring. No one has actually done anything. Usually there are some protests. Corpsec shove people around. Both sides are upset, but no one dies. The talks advance. The miners get a bit more pay and benefits. Both sides are mutually annoyed with the other. And I'm sure in a few years it'll all happen again. Barrow shrugged and seemed entirely unconcerned. Don't be so flippant, Kingus said, even as Barrow seemed to dismiss any concerns. We've had some communications troubles from NT 2125. The work of labor agitators, no doubt. Communications troubles. Why are you telling us that now? Barrow asked, showing some concern. I thought it was common knowledge. Kingus sounded genuinely confused that Barrow was unaware of this. Is it not? Executives on the ground have spoken of damaged communications systems and delayed reports from outlying facilities. Have there been delays in ore shipments? Or minerals or whatever? Barrow asked. No, in fact, due to our exemplary corporate structure, we're seeing increases across the board. Kingus nodded, clearly proud of this fact. So, in your mind, the labor agitators are breaking lines of communication, but not the ore shipments which you find significantly more valuable? Barrow asked, clearly not buying the idea. Don't be complacent. Just because labor organizers have been rarely violent in the past doesn't mean it will always be the case. I want your men on their highest alertness, Lieutenant, Kingus stressed. Yes, sir. I'll be sure to pass that along, Barrow assured him, even though Mary could tell by his tone that he had no intention of doing anything. What's the planet like? She asked next. The locals have called it Argyle, Kingus answered. It's our largest mining operation and a highlight of our terraforming technology. A dozen zones have been established across the surface, and 10 of them are already fully habitable without a suit. We expect work to be done on 6 zones within the solar cycle, and shall open up another dozen to be finished within the next 3 solar cycles. Mineral and ore outputs are quadruple expectations, mostly thanks to our unequaled refinery efficiency. Or maybe cause you're exploiting the shit out of your workers. Again, Gunny muttered this quietly enough to be missed by the others. Mary was settling into her seat as best she could when she heard the engines spool up. Inside the armored cockpit behind her, she could hear the pilots flipping switches. Systems check complete. Echo shuttle requesting clearance for departure. She wasn't sure if that was the pilot or co-pilot. Deeper, possibly male. We got a flight plan? Lighter, possible female. Maybe that was the pilot? Yeah. Navigator. Younger, more youthful. Not clear if male or female. Not much to it. Follow the automated beacons. Their spaceport is big enough for Tagmax freighters, so it should be easy peasy lemon squeezy. Human, definitely. We're clear. Co-pilot. Okay. There was a moment where Mary's hearing seemed to echo as she heard both the pilot in the cockpit and over the speakers in the hold at the same time. We're in real space and disembarking now. Remember to keep your hands and feet inside the ride at all times until we come to a full and complete stop. We know you've got no choice in airlines today, so suck it up because we're all you got. Also, definitely human. Gunny seemed to wiggle and settle in his seat, as if to take a nap. In general, the marine chatter in the hold seemed very relaxed and calm. A good sign. The most nervous person was likely Kingus, whose breathing she could tell was getting a bit quicker and more nervous. After another few seconds, she heard the engine spooling get more intense, and the shuttle picked up off the deck. Kingus tensed at this as his hands gripped the seat's armrests more tightly. While Mary wished she was in a superior curator craft, she was relatively relaxed. She'd flown many times, especially in her training to make sure she could translate even in stressful situations. Part of her wanted to mute her headset for now, to free herself of the need to listen to every jostle of the shuttle and the people within it, but she knew it was more important to maintain her ability to listen to the flight crew. For several minutes, however, she mostly had to fight her growing desire to take a nap. Gunny's breathing shifted into a soft and consistent snore, so he already fell asleep. The gentle rumble of the ship around her and her secure nature also lent itself to a desire to nap. Hey, did we check the sensor calibration before we left? Navigator. Yeah, total systems check. Everything cleared. I'm not seeing any problems. Pilot. Okay. Their tone implied things were not okay. She turned her head a little and began to dial up her headset, ignoring the other sounds and focusing on the cockpit. Another minute went by as she just had the hum of the engines and marine chatter around her. We're sure the sensors were checked? Yeah. Why, what's wrong? Pilot. It's just, doesn't make sense. I'm reading like, a lot of different atmospheres? Navigator. Yeah, they're terraforming it, so a lot of different atmospheric readings. Co-pilot. Sure, but some of these are bizarre. Like a nitrogen, maybe, and ammonia? She frowned as the navigator said this. Maybe those are the natural planetary atmosphere. Listen, everything else I've got is reading fine. Pilot. Ask ground, maybe? Terraforming? Accidents? Navigator. Resolute, this is Echo 2. Do we have any direct communication with ground? Over. Co-pilot. Pause. No direct comms at this time, but the nav beacons are loud and clear. Probably just some interference. I mean, if they've had a terraforming accident, it's probably hell on comms. Pilot. Yeah, probably. Navigator, entirely unconvinced. As she listened, she realized Barrow was staring straight at her. Did he suspect something? Was he on their channel? Something up? He asked. The navigator thinks there might have been a terraforming accident on the planet, she explained. What? How do you know that? Barrows looked from her towards the armored door between them. I can hear them, she explained simply. Did you say a terraforming accident? Kinnugs looked her way now. They say there's strange atmospherics on the planet, she revealed. I knew it! Labor agitators, he huffed. Tell your men to be ready for all manner of terrorism, Lieutenant. Barrow's answer was non-committal, but seemed worried as he focused on Mary. She was still focused on the cockpit, however. Was there a cruiser in orbit somewhere? Co-pilot. The, Tartar or something? At least on the mission brief. We tracking it anywhere? Pilot. No, I've got us. The orbital refinery platform and the Resolute. Navigator. Freighters, shuttles, corporate yachts, anything? Pilot. No. Navigator. They aren't seeing any other traffic in orbit, she relayed to Barrow. Barrow cleared his throat and seemed to trigger a mic in his helmet. Guys, shut the fuck up. Gunny, wake up. A Marine besides Gunny slapped the man's shoulder, causing him to jerk in his seat, and a knife seemed to appear in his hand. Wha? He looked around. Something's up, Barrow mentioned. No traffic, planetary comms are down, and terraformers are fucked up. Mary expected some smart comment, but Gunny tucked his knife away and just listened. Wait, freighter is taking off. Navigator. And I've got one leaving the orbital platform. Ping them? Co-pilot. Pilot must have nodded because he continued. Pinging. Pause. Both are automated. Both report. Systems are fine. No issues. Nothing from ground, emergency beacons, distress, nothing. Pilot. Nothing. Co-pilot confirmed. I mean, they'd be loath to stop shipping ore. Maybe it's just really comms trouble and they aren't flying anything right now. Cruiser might be on the far side assisting with some kind of recovery effort. I don't know. Pilot. That might be the case. The co-pilot did not in fact think that was the case. Resolute, this is Echo 2. Do we have any further mission details? Are we still go on landing? Over. He sounded nervous. We're still go. They think it's just comms trouble, but they're prepping more shuttles now for possible rescue or support efforts. I mean, everything I'm seeing is clear. Not even rain clouds. Pilot. They're saying there's comms failure on the planet. They found automated traffic only. No distress calls. Mary relayed. A moment later, the pilot keyed in a direct channel and she heard the voice through Barrow's helmet comm. Hey, Altia, just a heads up. We think there's some kind of comms failure on the planet. And maybe a terraforming accident. No signs of hostile action, though. Still prepped to land shortly, but, giving you a heads up. So they could talk to him but hadn't. Appreciated. I'll relay. He acknowledged. Then she had to try and focus a bit harder as Barrow began to speak to his Marines about the situation, but the flight crew was still chatting. Entering Atmo now. Any change in sensor reading? Pilot. No. Area around Argyle looks... Okay. Wait, that's the city, right? Navigator. Yeah. Maybe. Pilot. The shuttle began to shake a bit harder, though, from what she had experienced before. This was just normal for entering atmosphere. They were quiet as the shuttle rumbled, but after another minute the rumbling seemed to get worse instead of better. She was much more acutely aware of the groaning of the metal and just shuddering of everything around her. Kingis's teeth were rattling and clicking especially. Okay, what the fuck? Yeah, fuck. Co-pilot. What were they seeing? Just describe it out loud. I can't turn it off. Ground has us locked into our corridor. Navigator. Override. Pilot. I can't, I'm trying. Navigator. The shuddering of the shuttle intensified further as it seemed to be moving around, like the pilot was trying to shake them out of whatever their path was and kept getting pulled in. It's not using any normal code. I've got no fucking clue what this is. What the fuck is that? Mary winced at how loudly the co-pilot yelled that. So far, their voices had been full of stress and anxiety, but not fear, nor had they been loud. Jesus! Pilot. What was it? Look at it fucking move! Chaff! Flares! Dump everything! Brace! Mary cried out as she clutched her harness. She could hear the deployment of flares and chaff in a rapid series of bops and clanks. Then she could hear something hit the shuttle. But it wasn't an explosion, just a meaty metal crunch. Her body jerked hard in the harness as the shuttle around her began to spin, or jerk, or she had no idea, but it was twisting violently. Fuck! Pilot. Watch it! Co-pilot. Red lights immediately came on in the hold of the shuttle. She could hear as well as feel the violent collision as the port wing slammed into something. For a brief instant, she could hear the shattering of glass before her hearing was just overwhelmed by the rest of the crash and the screaming around her. The force yanked her hard against the harness as she heard the terrifying screech of metal being pried apart as the hold and the cockpit sections of the shuttle seemed to detach. Strapped to the jump seat, she could only watch in horror as the Marines before her were suddenly spun in a different direction, while Barrow and her were tumbling on the now suddenly exposed outside of the cockpit section. She was screaming as loud as her lungs could bear, but he was oddly quiet, as if resigned to their fate. She could see the city spinning around her, and the straps holding her began to give way as they were never intended for this. Barrow reached out, and for a moment she reached towards him, but then they hit something hard, and her body was sent flying free of the seat. Shattered debris of a ruined building rushed up towards her as her hand came up and blue. Her world was blue. A light blue sky, a gentle breeze, a few clouds lazily hanging in the air. She could hear the soft music. We're sorry for the inconvenience, but consciousness has been momentarily suspended to avoid further trauma. She was in hold. She hated hold. Well, she wasn't dead yet. Could she die in hold? Would she know? Your body is being evaluated currently. Did you know your suit is rated to withstand significantly more hazardous events than your physical body? Yes, I am aware of this. She answered the voice. She wanted to cross her arms and tap her foot, but she didn't have any at the moment. Or, well, she did. Hopefully. Still, anxiety began to fill her as she waited for death? Life? Consciousness is being returned now. Please be aware the process might be jarring. She had a fraction of a second to brace herself for what she knew would be "Ah!" Someone was screaming in incredible pain. Oh, it was her. Tears were streaming from her eyes and snot out of her nose. She tried to prop herself up, but something was wrong with her arm. Looking down, she had a moment to see how wrong it seemed to be positioned before the suit corrected for this, with a snap to restore her arm into a proper position. Ah! At this point, she just didn't have any more air in her lungs for screaming. She had to wordlessly sob from the pain of her arm being broken, either by the suit or the crash, and then set by the suit. She had no idea. She just curled up on her side in the rubble, gasping for air. That's when she realized it. Her headset. It had come off in the crash. Turning her head around a little, she tried to spot it inside her helmet. Sound began to build around her. The roar of a fire, several fires, the groan of concrete and rebar bending under stress, plus scratching. No. Whispers. Whispers, whispers. Distant, incredibly distant. Singing. She slowly looked up at the sky. Above her, she could see towering corporate structures of glass and steel. For a moment, she thought she saw a banner moving in the wind between two of them. Something long and ribbony in an unusual color. She needed her headset. The sounds were getting louder and worse. It wasn't clear if she could possibly be in any worse pain, but the splitting of her ears by the increasing sound was certainly making her start to believe death wouldn't be so bad, especially those whispers. Who could be whispering? Rolling over, she finally got her left arm up to her faceplate, lifting it before her suit chirped at her. Warning, low oxygen content in atmosphere. Recommended limited exposure. She ignored it for now and grabbed her headset, shoving it back into place. As it sealed to her ears, she let out a gasp of relief as the sounds immediately began to fade away. Still, she was quick to seal her faceplate again. She took a few seconds to just breathe carefully, and then tried to pull herself up. Her legs hurt. Her ribs hurt. Everything hurt. But she could get up, slowly. She was in the ruins of some kind of low structure. Ahead of her, she could possibly see a path out. Everything was hazy, as the crash had kicked up an incredible amount of dust, fogging up the air. Holding her broken arm close to her stomach, she stumbled through the ruin until she was fairly sure she was outside of the main structure, and now, in a deep gouge in the ground filled with more debris. Metal shards, glass, and concrete. Where was everyone? This was in the heart of the city, right? Now that the dust had descended, she couldn't even see the closest tower anymore. But they were in the city. Where were the rescuers? First responders? Anyone? Then, just ahead of her in the dusty fog, she thought she saw a figure, waving her forward. However, as she shuffled forward, she lost track of it. But then she did see the cockpit section. It seemed mostly intact. Barrow's seat was covered in a smear of blood and gore, however. Yet she didn't see any actual sign of him or his armor. Maybe he had survived? It seemed unlikely, though. While shuffling through the deep gouge in the ground towards the cockpit, she tripped, letting out a whimper of pain as she hit the ground, her broken arm under her body as she writhed around. When she looked back up, she saw another figure, but her voice caught in her throat. It was blurry. No, it was dripping. Even as she watched, more figures like it emerged out of the fog. They were shambling, large figures whose flesh seemed to just be dripping off as they walked. Big triangular heads and exaggerated features all around. Their bodies the same color as the churned-up dirt under the crash. Even as she adjusted her headset, she couldn't hear footsteps she heard. It was like something being dragged through mud. All around, she saw a dozen of these figures shuffling towards the cockpit. She just stayed on the ground, amidst the rubble and debris. They didn't talk. They just shambled, until they reached the cockpit. Then they just seemed to splat against the side, oozing all over the wreckage. To her surprise, one of them pried the armored door off the back, and then several seemed to ooze into it from the broken window up front. Then she watched them start to shamble out of the back, carrying 2 bodies. Had to be the flight crew. But what were they doing? Were they dead? They didn't seem to be resisting, but she noticed their oozing flesh seemed to be dripping all over them. That's when she realized it wasn't flesh. It was mud. Their gaping maws had faceplates inside, and lit up inside were human faces. She heard a soft crackle, and the biggest one spoke inside their mud suit? Yeah, just like we thought. Shuttle crashed, but we found a pilot and navigator still alive. Pause. Crash kicked up a lot of dust, but we're moving fast before it clears. Pause. Other survivors? Mary tried to will herself to meld into the rubble she was lying on. Haven't seen any. Heaven help them, though. We need to get back into the mines. I'm not waiting another minute. No telling what might show up. With that, the figure waved the others forward, and she watched the mudmen shamble away from the crash, seeming to just slowly descend into the mud as if absorbed by it. She waited there in the rubble for another minute until she was sure they were gone. Then slowly she stumbled to her feet. Her whole body hurt. Her arm was absolutely broken. She was alone, and as far as she could tell, so far this entire city was empty. Empty aside from the mudmen. What did she do now? She needed to leave, right? Her forehead got a little warm. She needed to reopen communication with the Resolute and continue her mission. So she looked around the crash site slowly and tried to remember which way the rest of the hold had gone. Picking the direction she hoped was right, she began to shuffle off in search of other survivors. She just hoped that distant whispering would stop. She didn't like it. The moment she found survivors, she'd crank up her headset. But until then, she shuffled and listened to the distant whispers in the empty city.